Good afternoon. Welcome today to the State of the States Budgeting in the Trump Era session. I'm Mark Mazur, the incoming Director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. We'll be replacing Len Berman next week, but the ever-efficient Tax Policy Center is already putting me to work. First thing I'd like to do today is acknowledge our online audience who are with us. I really encourage all of you to share your thoughts and observations using hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And for online viewers, we welcome and encourage you to ask questions or share comments by emailing events@urban.org. We'll make a point to use these questions and comments in the Q&A portion of the program. I'm really excited to be joining the Tax Policy Center, and I thank you all for joining us today to grapple with important issues surrounding our state's fiscal futures. The panel will examine obstacles and opportunities governors and legislatures will face and the decisions they'll face as they pass new budgets. And the budget process this year appears to be exceptionally challenging, given the uncertainty about what federal policy will look like in a wide range of areas. As the new administration stands up and new policies are shaped, it's important to recall that many of the programs being discussed are implemented at the state and local level. Educating our children, building our roads, provision of the social safety net is largely done by state and local governments, with federal funds paying for about 1/3 of state expenditures. And the federal government, through provision of funds and setting policies, affects the overall agenda. Independent of expected federal policy, state budgets are still going through a long recovery from the Great Recession. Although state revenues have been growing for the past 5 years, they remain below pre-recession levels in real dollars, and accordingly, spending and taxes are below 2008 levels in real terms in 32 states. States also face long-term liabilities, with unfunded pension liabilities and growing healthcare costs. And states are also entering the current budget cycle with about half of the states reporting unexpected shortfalls in revenue, in part due to economic conditions. Governor Brown opined about the incoming administration and Congress and said many of the proposed changes could have serious and detrimental effects on states' budget and economy. But concerns about changes aren't limited just to Democrat governors. Governors from Arizona, Kentucky, and Michigan all are urging caution in adopting changes, especially with respect to health care. Our discussion today will cover both the effects of federal policy and what's happening in state capitals. And if prior discussions are any indication, today's session should provide some lively commentary. In addition to the discussion this afternoon, there's also a brief available from our State and Local Finance Initiative, which examines potential effects of proposed policies. We're also excited to announce that the Spending Drivers web tool is going live today, and this tool will allow users to delve deeper into what drives spending differences across different states. We're fortunate today to have a group of leading experts to discuss these issues. Lori Montgomery, who's Deputy National Editor of the Washington Post, helps lead the paper's signature coverage of Washington, Politics, and the Nation, will be the moderator. And Lori has a storied career at the Post covering both the Obama administration's efforts to expand health coverage and the effects of the Great Recession. But it's also important to know that she has a broader set of experiences and began her career in Texas at the Dallas Times-Herald covering Ann Richards. So now let me kick things off by turning the mic over to Lori Montgomery.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to State of the States. It's my job to introduce your panel. So immediately to my right, we have Joe Henchman, the Vice President for Legal and State Projects at the Tax Foundation. John Hicks, the Executive Director of the National Association of State Budget Officers. Kim Rubin, Director of State and Local Finance Initiative here at the Urban Institute. And Nick Johnson, Senior Vice President for State Fiscal Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So we're going to start off by talking about a survey of the states done by NASBO. It's got to be a very uneasy time. I know here in Washington we're certainly having a hard time grappling with the new reality. I think since Friday we've had executive orders on ACA repeal, building a wall, banning Syrian immigrants, reinstating torture, opening CIA black sites. I mean, we put out the front page in the evening and we're ripping it up before we go to bed. So I can't imagine what state budget officers are feeling right now. Could you tell us where things stand?
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. Be glad to. My theme is cloudy with a chance of storms. States' revenues and spending, in the introduction said, they've been growing more slowly since the Great Recession than previous post-recession periods. We had, Mark said, 32 states are still not spending at the level they were before the Great Recession, adjusted for inflation. When you adjust for population, 39 states are still spending at a level lower than prior to the Great Recession. And for a period of recovery, this length of recovery, that's a bit of a surprise. Last year, in fiscal 2016, half the states had revenue shortfalls. This year, half the states are predicting revenue shortfalls. We haven't seen numbers like that since the Great Recession, when 36 states had a revenue shortfall in fiscal 2010. Prior to that, post-recession, we average about 10 states a year who have revenue shortfalls. So to have half the states in back-to-back years have revenue shortfalls, it's a combination of things. One, predictability, clearly, and the other is that economic conditions underlie most of state revenues. States are pro-cyclical, meaning most of their money comes from income and sales taxes that ride along with the economy. And so why were they short in the last 2 years? The answer is because economic forecasts were overstated. Growth in income and output and other things didn't reach what underpinned state revenue forecasts. So a couple of numbers. Last year, state general fund tax revenues grew only 1.8%. That's a very low, despite the low unemployment. This year, states have revised their estimates. They're expected to grow about 2.3%. Again, a very low number. And then next year, the budgets they're putting together right now, they're projecting a little sunnier revenue situation at 2.9%. So those are still historically low numbers. Personal income taxes took a hit in the last spring. Non-wage income came in lower than everybody estimated. Sales tax revenues are surprisingly weak given the economic recovery. You're going to see under 2% sales tax growth this year for almost a back-to-back year. Economists give some explanation, things like lower prices on goods and a gap between what's consumed and what's being taxed of that consumption. Online sales tax, for example, not being collected for states. You're going to see corporate income tax receipts decline for the second straight year. And we don't know yet what the impact of prospective federal tax changes are going to hold for this spring. Did capital gains get deferred from December to January, and what will we see in April? So we don't know yet, even though Congress hadn't made any tax changes yet. Energy states are still suffering, the oil states, and particularly two of the coal states, Wyoming, West Virginia. States have spending pressures. Medicaid has been growing faster than state revenues have grown. Pensions are a more notable issue that states have been dealing with in the last decade. Most of the states have reformed their pension systems in some form, but investment returns are still causing states to have to get out the checkbook. Medicaid has gone from 14% of the state's general fund to almost 20% in the last 20 years. That has crowded out other spending. Higher education has declined in terms of the share of state spending. But one good news is occurring since the Great Recession. States have stocked up their savings account, their rainy day funds, since the Great Recession. States on average are sitting at about 5% of state revenues, which is a little bit higher than where they were before the last two recessions. So states have taken the lessons from the Great Recession.
So Kim, Urban has a new report out, State Budgets in the Trump Era. What can you tell us about what the federal government is about to bring into this cloudy forecast?
Well, and so this is sort of either an exercise in, optimism or pessimism, or thinking that we know something about what is going to happen based on what people have proposed before. So what I did with Richard Oxier, who's my colleague at the Tax Policy Center, is we went through some of the things that have been proposed before by both President Trump during the election and Speaker Ryan and people in Congress to try and figure out whether we could forecast what we think is going to what they're going to do going forward. We talk a lot about taxes based on stuff that was going on in the Tax Policy Center and healthcare, ACA, Medicaid, based on sort of work that was done here at Urban by our Health Policy Center. But it is not complete. It is the things that we felt like we had the best grasp on. For example, there is nothing in this report that talks about the EPA. Not on my agenda, not on my, like, the fact that that's where we went first is sort of interesting. So what do? As Mark said before, state tax systems and spending are really reliant on what the federal government does. So about 1/3 of the money comes from federal sources to state and local governments. They set some of the rules and the agendas. If we think about what's been going on with healthcare in terms of sort of the expansion and coverage is largely based on incentives that were put into place by the federal government for state and local governments. And for the tax system, states typically use the federal tax system and the terms and definitions to do their own taxes, especially their income taxes. So if we think about especially states that are reliant on income tax system, often they conform to the federal system. So as we change the federal tax system, it's going to trickle through and affect what states do. So if I go through broadly some of these areas, and then we can get into details as we go along. So on the tax system, we think there's going to be a lowering of rates. There's some discussion of getting rid of some of the deductions, like the state and local tax deduction. There's some talk, although not a lot of detail, about broadening the base. So if we change rates, that's not going to directly affect states. If we broaden the base, that could help states. However, it could also, the uncertainty is what's kind of killing states right now. So I think part of the reason states' revenues are below where they thought they were going to be is because people are waiting to see what's going to happen, especially for taxes on capital gains and corporate taxes, as they're expecting those to go down. So if you're a high-income person and you have the option of realizing capital gains now, or waiting a few months and doing it in 2017 when the tax law and the tax rates might be different, you actually have an incentive to wait. And so I think partly we've already seen that in sort of some of the weak state budget forecasts. If we think about healthcare, there are two things. If we basically repeal without replacement of ACA, that means if states do nothing, they'll actually save a little bit of money, but millions of people will be uninsured. If they decide that it is unacceptable to have that many more people be uninsured, their costs are going to go up. If things had stayed the same, states were already seeing their costs go up because that 100% pickup on the federal government was going to start declining. And so they already thought that their Medicare, their ACA costs were going to go up. Irrespective of that, we also think that independent of whether they keep the expansion or not with Medicaid, it's pretty likely they're going to change sort of what the rules are. And there's a lot of discussion about block granting it, which would basically mean that states would get a certain amount of money based on sort of what's going on now, which could grow over time. And then states would have more discretion, but then they'd also have more responsibility for making sure that all the services are covered. And given that healthcare costs are growing much faster than most of the economy, that could leave them on the hook for more and more over time. There were some estimates that come out of CBPP that while it would only be a couple of percent shortfall in the next couple of years, once you get out 10, 12 years, that could be up to a 33% decline in the amount of federal money going for Medicaid, which would mean that states would actually have to figure out ways of replacing that money or cutting the services that they offer. And I'll stop there.
Okay, so Nick and Joe, I would guess that there might be some opportunities for states here, but it sounds like there are many more challenges for states here. Do you want to start, Nick, to talk about how states might be looking at this?
And I would say, cloudy with a chance of storms. That's an optimistic forecast. I think it's going to be stormy. And thank you all for having this session. And we have a great turnout here, which I think really testifies to a recognition that in this era, in the Trump era, states may matter now more than ever before. What happens in state capitals, what happens to states, is going to have a big impact on everything that happens in this country over the next several years. And the reason I think we don't have to be uncertain in our forecast that it's going to be stormy is that every president and every presidency, the first year of the administration, big things happen. I mean, I know there's a lot of uncertainty about which of the many big things that are on the table will happen. But it's, if you think about the first year of the Obama administration, the Recovery Act, if you think about the first year of the Bush administration, the tax cuts that year, think about the first year of the Clinton administration, the Reagan administration, big stuff happens. And particularly when we're talking about stuff that involves dollars, budget stuff can get through Senate with a 51 vote majority, right? You don't need 60 votes to do stuff if you're doing it through the budget reconciliation process. And a lot of the stuff on the tax side, on Medicaid and other programs that we're going to be talking about fall under that category of stuff that can be done through the reconciliation process. So I think it's going to be a really challenging and interesting years. Here's what I'm really concerned about in terms of the federal-state relationship. One of the most important roles that states play in our federal system is reducing poverty and expanding economic opportunity for families, for so many families who are having trouble making ends meet. And for the last half century, this has been a partnership between the federal government and the states. The federal government provides much of the funding, provides much of the structure, and it structures it in a way to meet changing needs. So if needs in a locality or in a particular community spike, if there's a factory closing, or if there's a national recession, these programs adapt. So the federal government is providing a lot of the funding and a lot of the structure. The states have some ability to innovate and to do things differently, state by state, community by community. And this partnership has turned out to be very effective. The best available data show that the percentage of people who are having a hard time making ends meet, as measured by our best approximation of the poverty rate, the number of folks living below poverty, has declined by about 41% over the last 51 years, largely thanks to this federal-state partnership. It's gone from about 1 in 4 to about 1 in 7 Americans living with incomes below the poverty line. Here's what's at risk of happening right now. The proposals that we have seen or that we expect to see from this administration and this Congress, based on what has come out of the House Republican caucus in previous years, what is in Trump's own plans, what his nominee to head the Department of Health and Human Services has put forward, these proposals would cripple this really effective partnership with damaging impacts on states and on families. Basically, we would shift this responsibility to help families make ends meet, to help them get ahead. We'd shift it from the federal government to the states at a time when states really cannot afford to take on this big new responsibility. As John said, states are already facing budget shortfalls. Things are going to be tight in coming years. Rainy day funds, reserve funds at 5%, that's great, but that's nowhere near what it would take for them to get through a recession, particularly if these federal programs, these automatically stabilizing programs that rise and fall with the recession, aren't there anymore. So if you think about Medicaid block grants, right, the chance that, I mean, it's not just 10 or 12 years out, right? In a very few years, states would start to get under the proposal, for instance, that the House Republicans put out last year. In a very few years, 2 or 3 years, states would start to get much less money than they would under current law, to the point where 10 years from now, they would be getting 33% than we might otherwise expect them to get. Another really key program for low-income families is the SNAP program, right, formerly known as food stamps, which is so key to helping families age meet. Right now, it's 100% federal dollars. So states administer it, but they don't pay for it. A block grant would shift that responsibility onto the states and give states this whole new area of responsibility for funding, again, without any additional dollars to pay for it, in fact, with less money. And this isn't just theoretical about what would happen, because we did this 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, we took the TANF program, which was a really important state-federal partnership to help families make ends meet, and we turned that into a block grant. It was $16.5 billion 20 years ago. It's still $16.5 billion in nominal terms, which means that after you adjust just for inflation, it's 40% less beneficial. And because it's a block grant and states can pull money out of it to fund other things, the money going into assistance for low-income families is actually dropped even sharper, even further. It's dropped about 73%. So the number of 20 years ago, the TANF program was helping about 2/3 of the families who are living in poverty. Now it's helping about 1 in 4. So we've seen what happens when you alter the structure, fundamentally alter the structure of these federal-state partnerships. So that's my big fear, and that's why I think, from a state perspective, from a state policy perspective, they're going to be getting all this new responsibility, new revenue, uncertainty on the tax side, and we talk more about the tax side, uncertainty with other parts of the budget, and we should talk about discretionary spending and all the other ways in which states get federal money. It just adds up to a really dangerous and challenging time, I think, for state governments.
Joe, what do you think states are taking away from this moment?
Yeah. First, I want to thank you guys for hosting, thank Urban Institute for hosting this. There's a lot of panels and events in Washington, D.C. all the time. But this one, I know for a fact, has real impact. Real decision makers watch these and have takeaways from these, and they lead to real results. And I think, as Nick mentioned, it's a full room here. It's not a small room, but it's every seat's filled, and we've got people in the back too. So it's certainly a hot issue in Washington, D.C. right now. I think I'm going to disagree with a lot of what Nick said, so let me start off with an area of agreement, and that being he and I certainly walk the talk in terms of states mattering. We've dedicated our professional careers to state policy. It's something I think a lot of people just give lip service to, but his organization and ours are certainly out there trying to make the states truly equal partners in the federalist structure that we have in the United States. That said, I'm going to disagree with his characterization of it as a partnership. No disrespect to any congressional staff or federal workers who may be in the audience, but for the most part, federal employees view the states as an administrative arm for spending money that they give to them with lots of conditions. And when this money comes, when it does the round trip to Washington to go back to the states, it picks up all of these mandates and conditions. And I've had plenty of Democratic legislators and governors in the states complain about these, let alone Republican ones. Usually the Democrats behind closed doors, but certainly it's not any partisan divide that it's not so much a partnership, but the feds set the rules and they give the money, and if you don't do what the feds say, they take the money away. We've talked about Medicaid a little bit. Medicaid, I've seen some numbers recently, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on it, but it's growing in state budgets about 4 to 5% a year, and it's crowding out everything else, and maybe just more evidence about how the ACA has not effectively bent the cost curve, and we need to try something else on it. Something that hasn't been mentioned on the panel at all, which I think is the fundamental thing, and if you're going to take anything away from what I say, let it be this: economic growth is the underlying issue here. Because if the economy continues to grow at 1 or 2 or 3% a year, you can complain all you want about how the feds are not giving 7% a year, or the revenues aren't growing at 6 or 7% a year, or we're not, the feds are not providing more money and all of that. Because if incomes and sales and property values and everything are only growing at the pace of the economy, there's not more money to be able to spend on these services and these programs. The pie is stagnant, and everybody has to fight over the crumbs. So, I mean, we can talk all we want about, well, how do we restructure these, or how do we complain and get the feds to give more money to the states, or whatever the solutions we're going to come up with. But ultimately, if you really want to solve this problem, we have to figure out, why are we growing so anemically? Why is our national GDP so low, and how can we fix that? And I'm not a Trump partisan. I don't think anybody can accuse me of that. But the focus on taxes and on federal tax reform, I think, is a good one, because that has a track record of being able to fix things if it's done correctly and if it's done in the right way. At the Tax Foundation, we've got our economic model that runs, if you've got a tax proposal, we run it through it, and it sees what the impact will be on economic growth, on job creation, and on the federal deficit. We've gone back historically and applied it to other ones, and we see the results that came out of the Kennedy tax cuts and the first Reagan tax cuts, which did do a lot for economic growth, and then for some of the other tax changes which didn't do a lot for economic growth. And there's some similar characteristics across them, especially in the treatment of capital and investment and wealth creation that matter quite a bit. And some of the ideas that are emanating out of the House Republicans and indeed out of the Trump administration, talking about a border-adjusted tax, talking about full expensing for new investment, talking about getting rid of a lot of the loopholes in the corporate code that induce companies to move overseas and outsource back to the United States. Moving to a territorial system where right now U.S. companies have to pay two taxes, the U.S. tax and the overseas tax, where their foreign competitors only have to pay one. Addressing those issues will certainly have an impact. And you know, Kim, you mentioned that some people are sitting on their hands waiting to see what will happen before they spend money, especially on tax policy. And I think that's exactly right. Tax policy certainly does change behavior. It certainly does induce people to make different decisions than they would otherwise. And so, you know, we're waiting to see what will happen on federal tax policy. I know state legislators are certainly waiting to see what will happen on tax policy, especially due to the close relationship between federal tax codes and state tax codes. But it's the only real good idea I've seen out there in terms of, you know, we talk about bending the cost curve a lot in Washington, bending the economic growth cost curve. Because once we figure out a way to get our GDP back up to what it was historically, then maybe the pressure will ease up a bit. You'll have a few more sunnier numbers, and Nick won't be so much worried about programs against each other. So that's kind of what I see the big debate happening right now, and I hope we can keep the discussion focused on economic growth.
Kim, you seem to have something to say.
Well, I guess I just, you know, I would love there to be, you know, more economic growth and higher economic growth. And I think you're right. I think if growth was higher, a lot of these problems would be easier. A lot of the things, and on the corporate side, I think, you know, there might be things that if they get it right could be helpful. But I think that a lot of what is being proposed by both the people in Congress and by Trump give a lot of tax breaks to the top of the income distribution, and it's not clear that it will lead to growth. And it will increase the size of the deficits, right? If we actually have an additional $6 trillion in our budget deficit and our debt, that's not the deficit, I think that could slow down growth. I think that there's some evidence that some tax cuts and some tax reform have helped, but I don't necessarily, you know, personally, I don't think that, you know, comparing sort of cutting tax rates and comparing that to sort of what was going on in the Kennedy administration makes sense given how high they were then. And I think taking some lessons about what we saw under Bush is really important. And so, you know, I am afraid that we will see, you know, a return to what we saw under the Bush administration where they cut taxes first and then they say that we're going to have reform, but there's no money left, and how you do that is really hard. So I guess I am less optimistic that we're going to see growth come from what is being proposed on the tax side as it now stands and how it's being proposed. I think that there's some room to do some of the things, but you know, I would like to think that if they're going to do changes to corporate, they at least do it sensibly. And if we're actually going to expense things, we cut, you know, the tax break for interest, say, which is not necessarily something that President Trump has proposed. So I don't want them to do things that we know are going to cost money and leave us even in worse shape to actually have funds to pay for things in the social safety net.
2 points. One, there's a paper on our website that goes through the historical tax changes, taxfoundation.org, and you can see what was different about the Kennedy and Bush tax cuts compared to the proposals today, especially on the impact on economic growth. And it certainly aligns with how you described it. Kennedy did a lot, Bush didn't do so much. Why is that? We don't just kind of wave our hands and say it was a tax cut for the wealthy, because both of them were, but they had very different impacts. The second point on the impacting revenue, absolutely agree with you. And that's one of the reasons we embarked on our tax model, to be able to emphasize, look, there are trade-offs. I'm a public policy student originally before I became a lawyer, and my mantra is always there's no solutions in public policy, there's only trade-offs. And when you are embarking on tax policy, you've got a distributional trade-off, you've got a deficit trade-off, and you've got a growth trade-off. And if you dial two of them too hard up, you're going to dial the other one down. To their credit, Speaker Paul Ryan and Chairman Brady have talked about making sure the overall plan is revenue neutral after accounting for economic growth, which is certainly more than was the case in the Bush administration. They're getting a lot of pushback from their caucus. I think Senator Rand Paul just this week said, well, don't worry about that revenue stuff. But they're holding pretty firm on that. So I'm hopeful that it won't be a return to the Bush era, as you said. As far as working to make sure that it's the corporate reform and the individual reform have good pieces on it, I look forward to our two organizations working together on that. We're very pleased that Tax Policy Center has followed our lead on developing a dynamic model that incorporates economic growth into calculations. That was a long time coming. I'm glad it's finally happened, and we can debate about these numbers on a level that actually incorporates the changes in people's decisions.
Well, and I think in part, and I'll stop after this and we can get back to states, right? I think in part the reason we were late in, incorporating the growth is because it's so assumption driven. And so when you're doing dynamic modeling and scoring, sort of knowing how much of it comes from the assumptions that are baked into the model and how it goes forward is really important, and it's something we took seriously. And so we're moving in that direction, that's right, but part of that is to try and tease out how much of what we're seeing is being driven by assumptions versus the actual policy.
And that's the debate we should be having, not whether it does or doesn't, but
we'll do that
how much
next
does
time.
it.
Although maybe I'll make Mark do
No,
that.
I just mean
Right.
I just mean generally it's
Yeah.
the debate we should be having.
I think to the extent that state policymakers are thinking about these current federal debates and what they want to say about them, I think it would be an enormous mistake for any governor or any state legislator to sit back and say, well, I'm just going to wait for the economy to start growing again thanks to all this wonderful tax policy that's about to come out of Washington. And I don't want to get into a big debate about the growth impacts of federal tax policy. I don't think that's where state policymakers are, and I don't think that's where they ought to be. Now, state policymakers should be thinking about bending that economic growth curve, to use the phrase. And in fact, that's one of the main things that states care about, that policymakers care about. Governors and state legislators are always thinking about their economy, their local economy, their state economy. Medicaid, just to go back to that for a second, is actually growing slower than private insurance, and it's actually cheaper than private insurance. States actually have a lot of incentives and a lot of tools with which to keep the cost of Medicaid down. Remember, states are picking up 43% of every dollar spent in Medicaid. Federal government is spending 53%. So they have really strong, on average. States, and they have incentives to keep those costs down. They also have incentives because the other big parts of the budget, education, transportation, public safety, are things that voters care very, very much about. And they're also things that are really important to state economic growth. When you think about taxes, I'm glad that TPC is building a model, and I'm wonderful the Tax Foundation is building a model. In the states, we actually have some examples of what happens when you have these trade-offs. What happens when you do big tax cuts? Because states have to balance their budgets. They take it out of the spending side of the budget. And what we've seen in most states, if you look at the states that have done these really huge tax cuts over the last few years, you look at Kansas, Ohio, Michigan, Maine, North Carolina, their economic growth has either been below the national average or right around it. You'd think if tax cuts had no impact on economic, were good for the economy, you'd have most of those states growing. And in fact, they're not. What they are doing is they're taking money away from schools, from higher ed, from transportation, which is stuff that we need to grow truly vibrant state economies. We've had economic growth in this country, right? There are people in this country who are doing very well. They just tend to be concentrated at the top of the income scale. So we have to think about what are the opportunities we're missing? Where are we missing chances to unleash the economic potential of huge numbers of Americans who are right now being left behind by and I think investing more in education, investing more in supports for children and families, investing more in infrastructure may be a way to get around This current issue of our economic growth is not perhaps in a lot of places where we'd like it to be.
We could probably spend a lot of time talking about tax cuts and economic growth, but I want to remind people listening outside the room that we're going to take questions shortly, and if you have a question, you should direct it to events@urban.org. In the meantime, let's go back to, let's take things in the order that Congress seems to be taking them and go back to Obamacare and the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. There are a lot of, we can unpack a little bit the effects for states. I mean, on one hand, you have the subsidies and the marketplaces and the increase in insurance. On the other hand, you have the expansion of Medicaid. Could we talk a little bit about what we expect them to do and how states will be looking at this, particularly since our president is saying that nobody's going to lose coverage and it's going to be better for everyone?
Well, let me start there. As it relates to the Affordable Care Act, I want to be sure and be clear. There really are three big elements: the private insurance market and the health exchanges, the expansion of Medicaid, but the core Medicaid program. And the third is the largest element that states are concerned about. The partnership is at least a financial partnership, as Nick described. The idea of states will all raise their hand if they say, can you give me more flexibility? 50 governors will raise their hand, as will all the legislators. More flexibility in block grants don't have to be the same thing. States have already exhibited they want to be at the table. This is the single largest expenditure in their budgets. It is the second largest expenditure of state dollars. So while TANF is in maybe an example, we've never seen anything like the prospect of block granting Medicaid at the state level. This is a first, so we have nothing to compare it to. And so, good or bad, what states are saying is, as I said earlier, states' revenues are tied to economic conditions. They rise and they fall. Medicaid intentionally is set up as partially an automatic stabilizer. When there is high unemployment and people lose their jobs and health care is a necessity, we have higher enrollment. So when there's higher enrollment in Medicaid, you have higher Medicaid expenditures. States' revenues are dropping or not growing very much at the same time. So those two things, states are not set up to be countercyclical in their financial arrangement. That was intentional. And so states want to make sure that there can be some innovations that states are still permitted to do in health care. And they have done them. States have been aggressive in changing the cost of Medicaid. It is a myth to believe that the matching rate of the federal dollar leads states to spend more in Medicaid. When you put a budget together with a governor and a legislator, they don't want to put the next dollar into Medicaid. They want education and economic development. That's where they want to invest. And so states have worked very hard at combining lower cost and better health outcomes, and do not want to take on the responsibility of being counter-cyclical when recession eras come.
So you asked what's likely to happen, and I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows. What they're doing so far is mainly repealing the tax side of the ACA, so all the taxes associated with it, they're going to go away. Whether they're going to do anything on the other side, on the programmatic side, I think remains to be seen. I know Senator Collins put out a proposal. I think Senator Rand Paul did too. I guess he's been busy this week too. So we'll see what comes of that. But healthcare is tough. It's tough to do whatever your background, especially since I guess taxes are important. Let's tie taxes into it. Of course, the deduction for employer-provided healthcare is wrapped up into it too, and that it's like 80% of Americans, or whatever percent, 60, 80%, a huge majority get their healthcare through their employer. And step one is the decision, well, do you change that or do you keep it the same? Because it's a very different decision trees going out from that afterwards. And at least a lot of the healthcare experts I've talked to really don't like that deduction. They say it really warps decision making, it drives costs up, and it's kind of a fundamental flaw there, but certainly a very one that people are used to, so it may be very difficult to change. On Medicaid, I'm glad you brought up the flexibility aspect of it, because Nick's right. It's a big part of the budget, and so you certainly have the incentive to make changes to it. Question is whether you're able to, given the federal rules associated with it. And it hasn't been mentioned yet, but Vice President Pence, then Governor Pence, expanded Medicaid in his state in a way, and he got a waiver from the Department of Health and Human Services in a way to bring some cost awareness to the low-income recipients. So if you make above a certain threshold, you had to put some dollars in for your co-payments or for your deductible. You have an account you can draw stuff from. Kind of a classic compromise that made everybody on both sides angry. People on the left angry that it wasn't a pure expansion of Medicaid. People on the right that he was expanding Medicaid at all. I don't know how involved he will be on, I don't think anybody knows how involved any one particular player will be, but at least that's one data point that maybe can provide some insight on what's down the road.
See, what I wanted to sort of piggyback on that, Joe's point brings up an important point. So when we talk about sort of block granting and getting more flexibility, it's taking away from the fact that states were actually given a fair amount of flexibility with the expansion, right? So they were able to take that expanded money and apply for waivers and apply to experiment and do some things. So I don't want to overstate the value of that flexibility with the block grant. I also think it's really important, and I think the point that it's a much larger program is relevant, but I do think it's worth focusing on a point Nick made, that when we actually block granted the TANF money, a lot of that money stopped going for the same purpose that it was going for, and it's going to pay for other things that states value. And so part of it is, if you actually think that there's a fundamental value to the safety net, and that having the federal government provide some lower level that states should be providing is important because there's less competition then if they're actually setting some of the rules. There is some benefit for there being a federal role in this. And much as people complain about, oh, they're sort of tying our hands and they're setting these policies that we have to follow, I think it is important to note that we are a country that people can move from place to place. And I think it's important to sort of set what we think are our basic standards for what we think are important for people to have in terms of health care and in terms of an ability to live. And so I think that there is some flexibility now, but I think states, if we actually move in this direction where we're sort of repealing it, and then also block granting that other part of Medicaid, not necessarily the expansion, but the whole thing, it could lead to some tough trade-offs, right? If some of the federal money is sort of kept at a certain level, and states no longer have the mandate to cover certain populations, they then have to make the trade-off between, do they want to use other funds to keep those populations covered, or do they want to spend less money but then have a larger uninsured population, the cost of which they're probably going to pick up a fair amount of in terms of other ways that they have to pay, in terms of if you think about uninsured payments for hospitals and things. So I think that there are trade-offs there, and there is a big benefit to having the federal government sort of be a partner and play this role, I think, and not just say, okay, we're giving you X amount of money, and now you decide.
And is there a difference in how Republican governors and Democratic governors are talking to Washington about what they expect and want out of this process?
I think what's surprising is how much similarity there is in what Republican and Democratic governors are saying. They are saying we want to maintain the basic structure of the program. We want to continue to get these funds. We don't want big cuts. And the other thing, there's similarity. Republican and Democratic governors have done a ton in using the existing program for flexibility and innovation. And it's not just about flexibility in terms of how much cost you shift onto the beneficiaries. It's flexibility on things like, how do you get providers to work together to reduce duplicative care and to communicate better in terms of the care that gets concentrated on a very small number of individuals. There are a lot of ways that states are, and a lot of that's below the radar because it doesn't erupt into partisan fights. But over time, researchers and policymakers have worked together, again, to keep the cost of Medicaid at a very reasonable price. I don't think there's any way that the scale of the cuts that are being envisioned in some of these block grant proposals or other proposals to change the structure. There is no way those can be accommodated at the state level without taking people off the program or severely cutting back the benefits that they receive. And that will have negative effects on people's health, on people's ability to afford health care, on the long-term health prospects of kids, and their ability to contribute to the economy over the long term. Coming back to the question of how do we strengthen state economies.
Joe, as you said, healthcare is tough. I mean, you sort of suggested that it's hard to tell what exactly they might do on the policy part of this. Do we actually think that Obamacare is going to go away?
Well, I don't think anybody would disagree that this is going to be an unconventional administration. I think the president might even hang that banner in his office eventually. So, you're trained never to say I don't know on these panels because you're an expert, so you must know. I don't know what the administration is going to do on healthcare, and I don't know if they know what they're going to do on healthcare. But as I said, it's a lot of people get their health care through their employer, and if you don't change that fact, it really limits what else you can do. You kind of end up back in the same decision tree that I think the Democrats ended up in 2009 and 2010 when they were crafting the Affordable Care Act. But that has a lot of downsides too. The fact that it's tied to employment means a lot of people are petrified about losing their job. That's one of the first things you think of if you worry about losing or leaving your job is what will happen to the health care for me and my family. It's not as portable as it could be if it was individual because it's almost all third-party paid, whether that third party be an insurance company or the employer or a government agency. Nobody ever asks and nobody ever answers the question of how much things cost. If you want to have a ball in the hospital or with your doctor, ask them how much some service costs. They have no idea. And about a third or a half of their clerical staff is filling out paperwork to get to the answer. And we all get these, this is not a bill. I can go on and on and on. I don't want to turn this into a healthcare panel, but there's some fundamental problems with our healthcare system that the Affordable Care Act didn't even come close to addressing.
Well, one of the ways that the Affordable Care Act did attempt to address the problem of employer-provided health care is the tax on high-income plans.
The Cadillac tax.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, I haven't written about this in a while. It's supposed to fully go into effect
18, I think?
2018?
2019, 2018. Yeah.
So do we think that that is actually going to happen?
It's, yeah.
I would think, and again, this is supposition, and I don't know what they're actually going to put into place, but the things that I personally think that they're most likely to get rid of are sort of some of the taxes on the Cadillac plans and on medical devices, right? So the things that they could take away the tax and say that they're changing it, and maybe that's sort of my optimism that maybe if we can do a couple of things around the edges, we can call it something else, but fundamentally not disrupt all of healthcare markets and lead to nobody being able to have healthcare coverage. But I would think that the things that are helping to balance the budget and make things sustainable, but don't seem like they're core for maintaining markets, are most likely to be cut. I don't know if others.
Let me make a broader point about tax policy that I think also takes us back a little bit to the conversation about states. So Joe pointed out that a number of members of a number of policymakers at the federal level have said nice things about the importance of revenue-neutral tax changes. The reality is that when you actually sit down and score, whether it's Trump plan, whether it's proposals coming out of Republican Congress, we are seeing tax plans that will cost the federal government
Trump plan loses a lot of money. Yeah.
5 to 10, not just the Trump plan. A lot of the when you actually get to the proposal, seeing it on paper, 5 to 10 trillion with a T. And usually when we talk about state budgets, we don't get anywhere near the T word. Right? 5 to 10 trillion dollars over 10 years. So in that context, where these enormous tax cuts have been put forward, at least in concept on on the table into the tax reform debate. We have these debates about, well, are we going to broaden the base? Are we going to broaden the base here, cut rates here? How's it all going to net out? There's a very big, from the state perspective, where you're thinking, okay, if they broaden the base, that might mean, as for instance in the 1986 Tax Reform Act happened, that might mean we get a windfall. If they start narrowing the base, we lose a lot of revenue. I think the whole tenor of this debate is going to be much more geared towards narrowing the base than broadening the base on that, and that's going to be a disaster for states. So the proposals around permanent exemptions for expensing, 50% exclusions for capital gains, these kinds of proposals would really be very damaging for state revenue systems. Another one, the estate tax. We haven't had in this first few days of this administration, the estate tax hasn't come up, but certainly it's been in all of the Republican plans to repeal the federal estate tax. It's been, and the president certainly in past statements has indicated that he would like to repeal it also. There are 14 states that have estate taxes that piggyback on the federal estate tax. For most of those states, it is the most progressive part of their tax code. It hits a small number of very high-income folks. They use that money to pay for education and roads and health care and human service and transportation and the other things that state governments do. If the federal government repeals its estate tax, it is going to be harder for states to sustain their estate taxes, and that's going to cost them potentially up to $3 billion with a B dollars a year, which is significant money in those 14 states. So watching this tax debate very carefully as it unfolds is going to be really important for states, and I'm not confident that tax reform at the federal level in this environment, in this era, under this president, is going to yield anything approaching the kind of windfall that states have gotten in past tax reforms that were truly revenue neutral, like in 1986.
So I thought you were going to go somewhere different with that. I thought when
any number of different
when
ways.
you started talking about the trillions with the T, I thought you were where you were going to go, which is something that worries me, is sort of when we blow that kind of hole in the federal budget and we have discussions about sort of what's on the table and what's off the table, what does that mean for domestic discretionary funding? And while there are all sorts of little programs that they're already zeroing out, it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of this goes down to states and local governments. And so if you actually have less money coming in and you're saying that we're going to spend more on defense, where you make up that money and what that looks like in terms of spending on these other projects that are even things that are said to be a priority. Like, I don't know where you get money to do like big infrastructure if you've cut this other side. And so I think it's worth always keeping in mind that the two sides of the budget need to work together, that if you actually have less money coming in, and we kind of forget this sometimes in Washington because deficits seem to be big and ever growing, but at some point you're going to have to figure out how you actually balance your budget at some level, whether you're cutting spending or raising taxes, or at what point people stop buying our debt.
So we're going to take questions very shortly. Again, it's at events@urban.org. But that raises a really great point, because in all of the proposals we've seen from this administration so far, the pay-fors just really are not so clear. And I would think infrastructure in particular has got to be an area where states are going, holy cow, what? I mean, could one of you explain what the proposal is? And
well, let me try. I mean, well, one of the ideas is to, in essence, repatriate corporate profits back into the United States and provide if you will, a tax break if those are invested into public or infrastructure projects of a certain type. States here in the United States, we call that public-private partnerships in terms of the types of financing arrangements that may go into particularly transportation in the United States, not solely so, but mostly. In that case, there are a good public-private partnership project that's out there today can get financing. People are waiting to invest in good projects. And so increasing the supply of capital can be invested won't necessarily increase the number of public-private partnership projects, because it's really the quality of the project and its ability to make returns that is the basics for that. So that doesn't necessarily, on itself, create more infrastructure. But if it is also seeded with real money, federal dollars or even state dollars that combine, many P3s have that combination of funding. They're not often 100% privately funded. Then that's the prospect of having more infrastructure with both investment from the public side as well as the private side.
Go ahead.
So I was going to be a Debbie Downer again, because apparently that's what I do. So reading through what was proposed when they're talking about $1 trillion in investment, it was...
This is the Ferrara document?
Yeah. This was baffling to me in that it's not, it's tax credits, but it doesn't even specify who gets to decide which projects are eligible. The other thing that worries me is these tax credits and this investment is supposed to be paid back through money raised by those projects, which could work if what you're talking about are toll highways or maybe even an airport. But if you're talking about things like wastewater or sort of treatment or bridges that need to be rebuilt or maintained in a place that doesn't actually have a lot of traffic, but it's really important, you know, we don't necessarily want bridges falling down in Nebraska just because they don't have the volume to, you know, pay for the building. I didn't see anything in that proposal that led to increased money for things like maintenance or for projects that weren't going to have some specific private return, which worried me.
I certainly agree with that. You know, let's use an example that I think a lot of people are familiar with. There's a bridge that connects Arlington Cemetery with the Lincoln Memorial, the Arlington Memorial Bridge. It's reaching its end of life. It's going to start falling down. If you're in DC, enjoy it before it does that. And you know, there's no tolls or anything on the bridge. I think it probably carries more foot traffic than road traffic. It's not the main bridge between Virginia and DC that commuters take. So how do we fix it? And you know, I'm not really sure whether it's the Park Service or the District of Columbia or who is responsible for it. But regardless, there's no money for it. And the administration, or I guess at the time, the campaign's document on that focused entirely on how to finance projects that have a stream of revenue. So, you know, over 30 years you have all this revenue. How do you turn that into money right up front? I don't know how much that really is a roadblock to not use a pun. That was unintended to a lot of these projects. For a lot of them, it's, well, how do you get the funding in order to be able to do it? So how do you get, I don't know how much it would cost to fix Memorial Bridge, but how do you get the money to be able to do that? At the state level, and since it's about states, let's bring it to states, they're solving this through raising more money for transportation. In the vast majority of cases, adjusting your gas taxes for inflation, their gas taxes for inflation, because they're set at cents per dollar, they don't update. And ITEP has something that's like half the states or something have done that in the last couple of years. There's been more public-private partnerships, more toll roads, more innovative ways to get the money. The Purple Line, which is a rail line that's being built in Maryland, they found a contractor and the stream of revenue, and they're going to be able to do it that way. So there's a lot of room for innovation in this sector, certainly in transportation. But it doesn't come, you know, you still get to the point where we need like $1 or $2 trillion worth of stuff, and tax credits aren't going to do it.
Yesterday, the vice chairman of the National Governors Association, Governor Sandoval from Nevada, said, "I don't have toll roads in my state, and I don't want them." But Joe is right. States have been raising revenues at this time of low economic growth and maybe cutting other kinds of taxes, personal income taxes in some cases. But they've come up and they're spending more and they're raising revenues more in order to fill the transportation.
Yeah. Instead, what they're doing is they're taking their income tax money or their sales, not in Nevada, their sales tax money in Nevada and other places and shifting it to bail out the transportation funds. I mean, New Jersey has done this for like a decade until last year when they finally passed a bipartisan plan to actually fix it. They muscled the Port Authority to give all of their money to the State Transportation Fund. They swept all the, everything you can do short of raising a gas tax. I understand raising gas taxes are incredibly unpopular. There was that congresswoman who was the deciding vote on the 93 one, and they all, her name was Marjorie, and when she cast the vote, all the other congressmen said, "Bye, Marjorie," because they knew what was going to happen to her. But we've all kind of gotten used to paying half price for roads and bridges because the money we're putting in vehicle license fees and gas taxes aren't covering the cost. And eventually you can only coast on that, for so long.
I think that raises a really important broader point about the relationship between states and the federal government going forward. So one attitude that states could be taking, but I think we're agreeing they shouldn't be taking, is sitting back and saying, okay, federal government, great. We're going to wait for all this wonderful infrastructure to flow down to us. Or states can chart a different course and to say, well, the people in Washington are battling over Trumponomics or Ryanomics or whatever we want to call it. In the states, we're going to try to, again, chart a different course. We're going to try to articulate a different way of doing things. I think they can do it on infrastructure. I also think they can do it on human services, on fighting poverty, on K-12 education, on higher ed, on investing in early childhood education. Talk about an economic development tool. So I think increasingly we are going to see governors and policymakers looking at what's happening in Washington and saying the sort of the anti-investment, anti-tax approach being taken by the federal government is not working in our state. We're going to take matters into our own hands and at the city level as well and go forward. And I think this is going to actually create tensions between what the feds want and what the states want. I know we have questions from the audience that we want to get to, but we also could talk about immigration, which is creating huge tensions between localities and the feds.
Well, and are we seeing, before we go to questions, are we seeing any states where we see innovations that could inform Washington decisions? I mean, are there states that are solving these problems or figuring out how to tackle them in ways that Washington should pay attention to?
I think there are a lot of those, and the National Conference of State Legislators, which is a group of, as it suggests, where all the state legislators come together. They're always putting on panels and events of, here's a legislator from this state, they tried something, and here are the good results and the bad results, and take that lesson as you will. One of the many tax issues I write on is marijuana taxation, states are going different ways on how they're legalizing and taxing, and how they're structuring that, which is good. Every time I come to this panel, I always reference Justice Brandeis's term, the laboratories of democracy, as our 50 states. And if you want high tax, high service, that's there for you. If you want low tax, low level of service, that's there for you. What we're always on the lookout for is the high tax, low level of service, or the low tax, high level. And we all want to find the low tax, high level of service. But it's a fundamental tension. What Kim talked about, we want this baseline level. Well, people disagree on what the baseline should be. And so instead, all of our elections and all of our debates are, well, what should Washington's one-size-fits-all policy be? When I really think we ought to do more letting states decide that and let people fight it out at the state level, and then we can come here and have the Illinois versus Indiana fight or the Vermont versus New Hampshire fight over which one is doing a better job.
I'd be really happy if the federal government would let the states innovate. The problem that I see in the next few years is that the federal government is going to make it actually harder for the states to innovate and address problems. John, you said earlier that states don't want to spend more money on Medicaid than they have to, and certainly that's true. But of course, there are times when that Medicaid funding stream really is helpful for a state who wants to, say, address the opioid epidemic, address the mental health issues, the behavioral health issues that are driving homelessness in so many cities. Using Medicaid money for community health clinics, which are so proven to be so effective in states, or in education, investing in things that we know work, better training for teachers, class size reductions in certain populations. My fear is that the cuts that are coming the way of states is actually going to get in the way of states being able to use those revenue streams to start experimenting with different stuff and implementing stuff that's been proven to work.
All right, I'll say
One last
thing.
thing.
Right,
and then we'll take your questions.
So one thing that is going on in the states, and this gets off of just, but right, where we are seeing states innovating in some ways on the tax side, if you think about things like pot tax, marijuana taxes, sugar taxes, they're looking for ways to raise money. Often we'll see states, if they need funds, going to tobacco taxes or things like that. The problem with having their budgets too reliant on these taxes that are arguably there, I don't think marijuana is being said to be something to sort of discourage people to smoke it, but in general, the way these taxes are set up, they're partly there to raise money, but they're mostly there to try and affect public health. And so there becomes a tension if a state's budget becomes too dependent on these taxes that arguably they should want to go to zero because they want the behavior to stop. If we think about something like cigarette taxes, or if we think about something like the new soda taxes so that we can sort of try and discourage young kids from drinking a lot of soda and getting obese, in some ways you're going to end up setting up this tension between your budget and the public health outcomes you're trying to do if too much of your tax revenue is coming from those types.
Year one, it's revenue neutral. Year two, the spending goes up,
Right.
but the revenue goes down, and you have this gap open up.
But you got to remember, states have, as I said, mostly an elastic, growing with the economy revenue stream. Some of these other revenues are stabilizers. They're not large portions of state budgets, but that next million is an important million.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start in the room. Does anyone have a question? In the back. And please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Thank you. My name is Renee Bryce Laporte. I am a consultant here in DC. A lot of the conversation has floated around healthcare and infrastructure, which is understandable. I have a workforce and education question. I talk to employers, Arkansas to Ohio to California to here in DC. Refrain that you hear again and again is, we can't find workers with the skills that we need. And the actual number people quibble about, but there's definitely a trend towards needing more education to actually do the jobs that are out there. Had Hillary Clinton won, you know, the thought was out there about helping students pay for their education. Maybe not going to happen here. What is, as you see it, the situation with states and helping students get the education they need to fill the jobs that we have?
You want to go?
I would start. States are working hard on that. You go and read state addresses by governors, and often you're going to see that very question, that problem raised, and ideas about how to improve that. Number of states are now moving to last dollar in for 2-year credentials or below. States are moving heavily into apprenticeships in non-traditional areas like IT. So a lot of governors are really trying to get to that issue of the skills gap, particularly in advanced manufacturing, healthcare, and IT are several areas that are being focused upon. So Tennessee, Oregon, Kentucky, several other states are also putting some money where their mouth is there in terms of assisting individuals to help pay for a post-high school credential that is related to in-demand industries and in-demand jobs.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I do think under the Clinton plans, we saw more focus on how you incentivize and how you get training and funds for training, and I think that's really important. I think in some ways, I'm a little sad that we're missing that part of the conversation, that if you think about sort of what's being talked about, how we're going to restore, good jobs for people who live in America. I'm sad about the fact that there's not more emphasis on how we train people to do new jobs rather than focusing on sort of beating up why jobs have left, because it's sort of backward looking rather than forward looking. And I think states are trying to figure out ways of getting their populations the skills they need for these jobs. But I don't think we see a lot of discussion about that in Washington.
It's far more technology than China or trade. And I talk to a lot of people too, and I hear the exact same thing, that our education system is not preparing people for the modern economy. And back in the day, my grandfather's day, you would start a job at 20 and you'd retire at 65, and that's the one job you'd have in your lifetime. Whereas here, for my generation and the ones after it, it's going to be a lot of different jobs over your lifetime. So you have to be flexible enough and have enough skills to be able to do all of those things. And we're just not preparing for that. There is some innovation from the states, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done to completely overhaul it, and a lot more accountability. I'm from California originally, and people still talk about the days when Pat Brown was governor in the 60s, when he built the university system and the water project and the highway system, and a lot of capital investment, a lot of rethinking how to do things. The university, the way we constructed in California was new, it was different from how it had been constructed in the past. A lot more focus on the real life, and I think it takes that kind of reinvention now. I mean, the reason we don't have the money to spend a lot on it is in education is a lot of the money into education goes to union salaries, to protecting. Everybody in a public school had that employee who, that teacher that had checked out long ago, and you just couldn't get rid of them. And there's a lot of public employee pension funds that are underwater, and a lot of money. Like in Chicago, they just did a property tax increase for education. A lot of it's to bail out the pension fund. So
the reason they're underwater is not because too much money has gone into them. The reason they're underwater is that not enough money has gone into them, right? I mean, what's happened in education over the last 10 years has been essentially a flatlining of funding for it. We've got essentially a lost decade going back to 2007. There's actually 23 states now that are spending less on K-12 education than they were before the recession, in this era when education and investment in workforce and so on is probably more important than it's been in the past. And the situation in higher education is even worse. Most states are now spending less on an inflation-adjusted per-student basis on higher ed than they were 10 years ago. The challenge, of course, for states is that one of the big reasons they don't have enough money for education is that education is funded at the state and local level, and as we've all talked about at great length on similar panels like this in the past, state and local tax systems are antiquated and desperate need of modernization. We have sales tax bases that we're taxing goods instead of services. We're not taxing goods purchased over the internet to nearly the extent we should be. Corporations have far too much room to move their profits around from state to state to minimize their tax sales. A lot of states have flat personal income taxes that fail to capture all the income growth that's happened at the top of the income scale. Tax breaks for senior citizens. I mean, states and localities bear some of the blame here for failing to tend to their revenue systems in ways that would generate the funds necessary to make the investments in economic development, like what you were talking about.
just speaking on spending adjusted for inflation, right before I sat down here, I retweeted out a graph somebody posted on a various number of costs over the last 10 years adjusted for inflation. Tuition was number one on the list. It's like tripled or something in real terms. Student textbooks not far behind, so that's where I think a lot of the money ends up going, and people, and whose pocket ends up in. And then a lot of other, housing, transportation, they were right about at the inflation level. And then most consumer goods, clothing, computers, et cetera, were far below. They're less in real terms than they were back then. It still shocks me that with the technological revolution that we've had, with the transportation and communications revolution that we've had, that we still teach students pretty much the same way we did 150 years ago. And that has to change.
Right here, you in the black sweater. Oh.
Jennifer Porcari from the American Federation of Teachers. Too many mics. Lots of questions, but I'll start with just one. I guess I'm surprised that nobody has talked about the impact of sequester and what that's going to do to the state budgets. As I travel around the nation talking with union leaders, I tell them to anticipate a 10 to 15% cut in the federal dollars coming to the states based on the eventual implementation of the sequester. And I think Trump talked about that as he was going around the nation, and I wonder if you could just address that.
I feel like that's all Nick's been talking about is federal funds.
Right. So
We haven't been talking about non-defense discretionary. You talked a little bit about
Right.
ADD earlier.
Well, let me give you some numbers from the state level. In the last 10 years, if you toss out Medicaid, states have been getting about 13.5% of their budget last year was federal funds, excluding Medicaid. That was the lowest that we've seen in about 10 years. And so states have already been living with a flatlined or slightly declining set of domestic discretionary programs. Now, our friends at the Federal Funds Information for the States kind of show that if sequester goes into effect in 2018, I think there was about a $4 billion drop off of a $519 billion base. So don't yet see what that is and to which programs. In education, states receive significant amount of money on Title I, the IDEA funds, school nutrition. Those are some of the biggest federal grant programs that go to states that aren't Medicaid. And so we're waiting to see. Don't know what the percentage change is, but based on that information, there is that would be what a 1+% reduction.
And I was just going to say, so I think part of the reason I didn't use the term sequester, and we haven't really talked about that, because of all the things that are changing, I feel like those rules are in place, but because we have a Republican majority and a president who's a Republican, as they play with the budget and how they come up with their decisions, I'm not sure what was decided there is going to be what's relevant. That's not saying I think it's going to be better, because I think actually if we have less money and they're talking about having more money go to defense, and when we don't actually know what they're going to actually do with Social Security and Medicare, it might actually leave even less money available for those discretionary domestic programs. So I actually think it could be worse than what we are expecting under sequester. I just think that what we're going to do is we're going to see almost a reset in what the terminology is and how they go forward.
No, but your basic point is right. It's really important to pay attention to that category of funding that we so artfully call non-defense discretionary. And I don't know why we don't have a better phrase for it, but we got to come up with a better phrase for it, because people don't understand what we're talking about is funds for schools, for school lunches, for the WIC program, for roads, for public safety, police officers in cities, for housing, community development, housing vouchers, just a whole range of programs for scientific research that are under this awkward bucket. And I think probably a lot of state budget officers don't understand it. Probably a lot of state legislators don't get it. But as that gets ratcheted down over time, as it has been, right? That category of spending is now at its lowest level historically as the share of the economy since the 1960s. And so we are squeezing that chunk of funding and potentially accelerating the squeeze in coming years, depending on what the budget parameters are set up. That's a real sleeper one to keep your eye very closely on.
And I don't want to put that squeeze at the foot of the Republican Congress or the Republican president. I agree that it's happening, but I think it's more of a structural thing associated with, especially the growth of entitlements. I mean, the CBOs and the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, and pick the group, they've been putting out projections for years and years talking about how if we just put everything on autopilot, entitlements will squeeze out everything eventually in the coming years.
But it's worse if you actually cut taxes a lot.
Yeah. There's a lot of things you can do to make it worse, yeah. But it's something that's on the radar, and I think for states that are used to getting so many millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, I think you're right to be saying this is something we have to think about, that this may happen. And whoever's telling you it's not going to happen, you tell them they need to think about it.
But let's not imagine it's some force of nature, right? It is a deliberate policy choice that probably, it is very likely that at least some of the leaders in this Congress and this administration will actually try to accelerate that trend artificially by ratcheting down the caps further.
Okay, over here in the check shirt. Yeah, you.
Hi, my name's Chris Scher. I'm
Said the
from
guy with the
University
nice
of North
smile.
Carolina, and I also work for Senator Joe Manchin's office. My question's a little bit more broad, and it's about the uncertainty of what the new administration has talked about. So on Tuesday, the Budget Committee had their hearing for the nomination for the Office of Management and Budget, Congressman Mulvaney, and they really tried to hit home about his ideas for entitlement program cuts and reform. But they also tried to hammer home about the contrary and the differences that was with the Trump campaigns and how he does not want to cut the various entitlement programs. How do you see the differences between the new proposed leader of the OMB and the Trump administration, how that's going to affect their policies and their budget priorities?
I was going to say that I feel like the person who's being considered for OMB is actually taking the fact that you have numbers that have to add up or not seriously in a way that I'm not sure all of the rhetoric and all of, the proposals that were part of the campaign, and, and in his defense is often a part of any campaign, don't necessarily add up. But, if we think about some of the specific comments that have been made, it is impossible to think about how they are all satisfied. You cannot, cut taxes, guarantee that health care does not, nobody loses health care, and we're not going to cut any entitlements. Like, these things don't work. And so in some ways, I feel like it's tough to be in those hearings and have to answer these questions if you are a serious person who is trying to come up with sort of what the policies are, because almost by nature, and we've seen this in other hearings, and this gets beyond sort of states, we've seen people sort of ratchet back or sort of pull back a little bit from some of the statements that we've seen either from the president or during the campaign.
That's a common thread you see from the organizations here on the dais, is that we all work to make sure the numbers add up. There's lots of organizations out there that don't and just want ice cream and cake and without without eating any vegetables, but we're out there pushing for it. And if I forgot to say, Kim Rubin has an excellent paper out with the Urban Institute, and be sure to read it, because it walks through a lot of those trade-offs, especially on how they affect the states. As for what will happen, I think in practice we won't see a lot of public daylight between the OMB director and the White House. The past, there's been a lot of private contention between presidents and their OMB directors, because they are the people who want to make sure the numbers add up. But as for what will happen, well, you're working for a swing state senator, so you know more than we do. Or a swing senator, yeah.
So let's take a question from somebody watching outside the room. This comes from David Merriman, a professor at the University of Illinois and the University of Illinois at Chicago. The question is, I have recently heard that some policymakers are considering the possibility that the ACA may be altered to offer states an option between keeping something similar to the current Medicaid expansion or opting for some kind of Medicaid block grant program. Is this a realistic possibility? If so, is it viable? And in general, is it advisable that federal policies offer states choices between different types of fiscal partnerships with the federal government?
He's talking about the Collins-Cassidy proposal that came out earlier this week. I won't speak to it. There's some great papers on our website that folks should definitely go and read. And I think the answer to the second question is that the devil is in the details. And so if you want to know the devil about this proposal, go read the papers on our website. More generally, it depends.
John, do you want to tackle the question of whether it makes sense to offer these very different partnerships with states?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. In general, states, as I said earlier, states would say, give us flexibility, tell us what the purpose is, and let us engineer the way we do it in our locality. So I'd say in general, states would be, the sitting elected officials in a state would be happy to have the choice. The elected official 20 years from now, I'm not so certain.
And if the choice is do the same or more, but accomplish it with less money, that's not going to go over very well in the states, I would say.
It depends on the choice. This is probably something the Obama administration didn't give enough credit for, but they did a lot of trial programs and small grant programs to try to offer these. So they did one on education of, here's some extra education money. You have to either, I think, like fire your principal or send everyone through training or become a charter school, or it was 4 options, and nearly everybody picked send everybody through training, so it didn't really result in anything. And then on unemployment insurance, they had it was kind of pick 2 of the 4 in order to get some extra money for administration, and that one I think had some better results. I'm all for flexibility, but of course, for healthcare, the goal is we want healthy Americans, and so does it do that or does it not? That's the question.
Other questions? Here in front.
Hi there, Zach Barn from CBO. One of the core questions when looking at Medicaid and flexibility with the states is how much money they spend on mandatory services to mandatory populations versus optional services to optional populations. There's a figure pre-ACA about 10 years ago that was estimated, I believe it was 60% of the average of state Medicaid spending was on those optional services to optional populations as a cumulative total. Apparently the data were a little bit faulty at the time. It's kind of hard to get, so a little dubious what that is. But with less spending available potentially in the future, where do you think, or will states draw money from other areas to continue funding those optional services?
I think that's where we're going to see people having hard choices to make. I think we're going to see some states doing that. And I think, ironically, in the report that our Health Policy Center here put out a few years ago, in part, they actually found that the states that have been more generous now would have an easier time to sort of figuring out where to put that money, in part because they could raise money more easily. It could be if some of those optional services have been covered with federal funds and you're in a state like Mississippi, they might have a harder time finding the money to maintain those services. But I do think it's setting up some tough choices for states to make the decision about whether they're going to shift money to provide those services or cut those optional services. I think in the Great Recession, we saw some movement on the parts of states, I think with like dental and vision, where basically there were optional services there that then got ratcheted back. And some of that could actually, lead to bad consequences if you think that if somebody has, can't see a dentist for a number of years, that could become something more serious. So I think there are hard choices, but I'm not sure we know, and I definitely don't think it would be one size fits all. I think we're going to see variation across states as they have to come up with the answers.
Probably have time for maybe one more question. There was one in the back, right here.
Hi, my name is Jen Budoff, and I am the budget director for the DC Council. Yesterday, Trump signed the executive order limiting federal grants to sanctuary cities, and the district is a sanctuary city. We receive over $1 billion a year in federal grants, for everything from refugee resettlement to homeland security to grandparent caregivers, it runs the gamut. So I was wondering if you had any insight on the types of federal grants that might be targeted through this executive order and the impact on states and cities in general.
Yeah, it's really unclear, right? It could be really narrowly, could decide we're going to do this really narrowly. It's going to be around a few Department of Justice grants or Homeland Security grants that are sort of more targeted around this law enforcement issue. Or it could be much more sweeping. I mean, if you read the language of the executive order, it seems to at least contemplate the possibility of very draconian hits to cities and to potentially a couple of states like Connecticut and California. And the challenge is, and from a state and local perspective, the problem is that you're really catching folks between a rock and a hard place, right? Because this sort of nickname of sanctuary cities, I don't think that gives a real accurate picture of what actually happens when when a police department is required to hold people under these ICE detainers. There are costs for incarcerating that person. There are costs for processing that person. There are potentially legal liability costs for violating that person's Fourth. There have been court cases where people who, where a locality that violated someone's Fourth Amendment protections against search and seizure was sued because they were doing it in ICE detainer. The federal government doesn't reimburse for that. So you've got a set of costs to the local city that they would come about if then they started doing what ICE wants them to do. And on the flip side, you've got the federal government threatening to take away money if they don't. I think those costs are why it's interesting. Last year, more than 20 states actually considered laws that would prevent localities in those states from rejecting. They would require the localities to abide by those ICE detainers. All of those lost in state legislatures, including in a lot of really conservative state legislatures. And I think it was because they were hearing from police chiefs, they were hearing from mayors and city council members that they didn't want those costs, and they didn't want their cities made less safe because their police departments couldn't do their jobs because they were so busy paying attention to what ICE was telling them to do. So I think it's going to be really interesting, and I think if they push it far, my understanding is that if they push what the funds that they cut to cities who are in the sanctuary city rule, we're going to see lawsuits about that, and it's going to be years of legal action. Again, back on the theme of uncertainty, it'll be really interesting and challenging to see how that plays out in the coming years.
Well, the theme for today is stormy weather and uncertainty, so that seems like a good place to close. I want to thank the Urban Institute for hosting this event, and thank Joe, John, Nick, and Kim for having such an informative panel, and thanks very much for coming.